Tamanova, and I'm happy to see everybody here in Brain Hub, the main discussion platform in Ukraine, which was created by Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. Today is day 505 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. It's been 10 years of the war, and the problem we will be facing and are facing now, and we will be facing upon our victory, is the problem of return of the Ukrainians back home. So today we will discuss this topic, whether we have a hope to bring all the Ukrainians back home. I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Karen White and UNHCR Assistant Representative for Protection, Alina Helashvili, analyst at Cedos Analytics Center. Also joining us is Lubomyr Mysiv, Deputy Director of Sociological Group Rating, and Oleksiy Pozniak, Head of the Department for Migration Studies of Tuha Institute for Demography and Social Studies of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Good afternoon, dear friends. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Karen right away. Recently, I think 2 days ago, Ms. Carolina, the representative of your agency, was presenting a study about the return of Ukrainians, about their intentions and their sentiments. And we remember that one of the results of that study is that the Ukrainians mostly want to get back home, and even during all this period, this indicator does not reduce. It stays at the same level. So let's talk about the number of Ukrainians staying outside of our country. To what extent is it so, in your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at present, UNHCR estimates that there are some 5.9 million Ukrainians who are currently recorded as sort of having international protection needs across Europe, and some 6.3 million globally. Certainly, the number, I think, has changed over time as we improve together with hosting states our capacity to record the number who are there. And so you will have seen some changes on our website with regards to the numbers. But we do believe that now the numbers that we are reporting together with those hosting states are more accurate than the ones that we were reporting before. As you indicated, UNHCR has been conducting a series of intention surveys. So this report that Carolina presented a little while ago was the fourth survey of intentions of refugees, and the second one for people who are internally displaced within Ukraine. And what we are seeing indeed, as you said, was that the hope and the plan to return has remained relatively stable over time. And what we see is that the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, both displaced abroad but also displaced within Ukraine here, remains quite high. So 76% of refugees and 82% of internally displaced Ukrainians indicate their hope or their plan to return home someday. And some 15% of both those displaced abroad and those displaced within Ukraine plan to return home in the next 3 months. So these are, I think, very important numbers for us, both as a humanitarian agency working here inside Ukraine to help us understand where we need to target our support to make sure that people are able to return home and remain home in a sustainable manner, but also to help us advocate with the international community to provide support to the government of Ukraine and to the people who want to return home so that Ukraine is able to rebuild and to recover, and that people continue to want to return home and are able to do so.
Дякую вам, пані Аліна. Ваш центр системно.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alina. Your center is studying the problem of refugees on a systemic basis. What are, in your opinion, the obstacles for Ukrainians to come back, and what are the stimuli for them to come back to Ukraine? Thank you very much. In fact, the overall opinion about returning and not returning of Ukrainians back home is that people think whether they should come back home in view of the problems and issues that they were considering when they were taking decision whether to leave or not to leave Ukraine. So there is no unambiguity in this issue. It was important for the people. Well, the most important factor was the security and safety, but not for all the people. It became the stimuli to live abroad. For example, what was also important was the matter of employment, of jobs, improvement or not improvement of their financial stance. They were hoping to get some financial support abroad. Also, for those people who lost their homes, they were hoping to get some at least temporary residence abroad or inside Ukraine. And what's also important is the opportunities for development and education of their children. So those are the factors that appear in the responses of our respondents. What among the factors that they would consider when they take the decision whether to come or do not come back. And in that period, they would consider the conditions offered by Ukraine compared to the country they moved to. We understand that a huge number of people, they in fact declare their intention to come back, but we have to understand that this return is not going to happen right away. It will be a gradual process. Different people will be considering different aspects which are of importance to them, and based on that they will take the decision whether to come back or not. Well, we were talking about the security, and really the security factor is really one of the key factors for them. But what's important to note here that people interpret the notion of security in a different way. For some of them it's the end of the war. For others it's not mandatory for the war to end. They think that they would be able to come back even given or only given that their place of residence would not be occupied. If they are being guaranteed this option, they will consider the situation safe for their return. For other people, it would be the cessation of missile strikes, and for others, it could be guarantees from international partners that the second stage of the war or yet another war would not start after this ends. So talking about those aspects, we have to know that people interpret those notions in a different way. They understand it in a different way, and obviously they will be thinking about the jobs, about their employment opportunities. They will pay attention to the opportunity to get a new residence if their home was destroyed or damaged or otherwise. So this is how they will consider those are the general reflections. I think that we may be able to come back to them and talk about it in detail. Well, recently there was a research by a German institute that says that 44% of the Ukrainians staying in Germany now are going to stay there, and they think it would be a good decision. Mr. Lubomyr, what are the figures that can be confirmed by your agency? What can you tell us based on your experience? Well, thank you. I've seen that study. I've seen the dynamics of change of our refugees who currently stay abroad. It depends on the period of the stay, because it's a key factor. We don't know how long the war will be going on and what will be the opportunities for the Ukrainians who come back, for them to take that decision. As we mentioned today, more than 70% of those who left after the 24th of February, they declare, and that's the key word here, that they declare, they're not convinced about that, but they declare that they intend to come back to Ukraine. But the key factor, as my colleagues mentioned, is the security, connection to their families, jobs, And yet another factor is their emotional connection to their homeland. In each age category it will be different, and Germany is an interesting example in this case. It's a country that creates the conditions that are maximum comfortable for the adaptation and for young capable population. First of all, the key reason is the language adaptation. For those who intend to stay there, if they know the language, the probability of their return is lower because they can get employed in the country of their stay. Another factor, as it was properly mentioned, is the availability of residence here. Yet another factor, an important factor, is the job, the financial condition. We had this research recently for the civil organization Opora. So the factor, for example, for those whose financial condition improved abroad, they would not be coming back, and for those whose financial condition deteriorated, they hope that they can get back to their past comfortable lives as soon as they come back to Ukraine. So those basic economic and financial factors and the factor of language adaptation, they are the key factors for the person to take the decision whether to come or do not come back to Ukraine. Germany is probably the second largest recipient of our citizens. So according to a study, and I think that UNHCR can confirm it, that Poland and Germany have the biggest number of Ukrainian refugees, and they will fight for them. They will create the conditions to replenish their job markets with Ukrainian employees, and it's a challenge for our country because those will be coming back who would not be able to adapt there abroad. Those who've learned the language, for example, and those who would be able to get jobs there, there is a high probability for such people to stay abroad. Mr. Oleksiy, what are the plans of the Ukrainians that you see? Well, it's a big problem. First of all, we should start doing things now that later on can be laid as fundamental for development of the policies for return of Ukrainians, because now it makes no sense building such policies, but we have to lay fundamentals. First of all is the maximum preservation of connections with the Ukrainians who stay abroad, is the opportunity of their remote employment, save for the spheres where there is a secrecy or something like that. That's a whole different kind of problem. But the opportunity of remote study, of remote education through Ukrainian international school, or preservation of connection with the Ukrainian schools in general. If children attend schools in the recipient country, they should continue doing it because they should not feel isolated. So I'm not talking about study of all the subjects that are being learned according to the Ukrainian education program, like Ukrainian language and Ukrainian literature and so on. And then another issue that we were discussing for a long time, and it's not so much about our new forced migrants as the pre-war labor migrants. For them, it's important to preserve Ukrainian citizenship in case they won't be able to obtain the foreign citizenship. There are draft laws developed on the double citizenship of Ukrainians, but it's a matter subject to discussion so far. And also their participation in the elections is yet another factor that is considered by them, because after the end of the martial law, we understand not everybody will be coming back at the same time, and opportunity to take part in the elections is an important, is something that preserves their connection to Ukraine. For our citizen who stays abroad to vote, they should visit the nearest consulate, sign up and then on the day of voting to go there again. Sometimes the countries where they stay are not so small and such travels may be difficult for them. In the world there are procedures of remote voting developed, so those are the fundamentals that we should start laying now for the future policies. And after the war ends, obviously there are high hopes of the support that we are being promised by the economically developed countries that would stimulate the development of economy, the recovery, and it may all be seen quite attractive for part of our forced migrants. Thank you. Well, as it was also mentioned, the reconstruction of their homes is important too, because some of the migrants may wish to come back to another region, not the one they originate from. There is an experience of Balkan countries when the people who potentially wanted to return, they were offered to come back to Balkans and to see the conditions of living that they can count on in case they return, and they were allowed to take the decision whether to come back or not. Reconstruction of not only homes but the whole infrastructure, even if people have normal homes, good living conditions, and they feel secure, but if they commute to their job through the ruins, it would not support their good sentiment, their good mood. It's yet another factor that may make person ponder over whether they should come back abroad. Well, we're talking about 6 million here. 6 million is the figure that tells us about the future, about the demographic crisis that is happening now. Any demographic crisis has impact on economy, and we would like to continue the topic that Mr. Oleksiy has started. What we should do, what should the government of Ukraine do not to have it transformed into an economic crisis? Well, it's a difficult question because we have to understand what will be the conditions that we end up in at the moment of our victory, but the key condition for the return, because we have to understand that we will be facing social and economic crisis right upon the end of the war. So that factor will be the level of salaries and the conditions of doing business in our country. So it will be one of the main factors for the youth, because we're talking about those who are most important to returns, because so that's why we're talking about the youth, because they can create the added value, they can work at the industrial facilities, because the pensioners, due to their health condition, would not be able to do that. So this is something that's being discussed in all the platforms on Ukraine. What are the economic conditions? What should be the economic miracle Ukraine should produce to make the youth interested in getting employed in Ukraine under conditions of recovery, because somebody still has to build the roads, to build the buildings, and on the other hand to create the products that will create the added value and to replenish the budget. It won't be a big secret. We may forecast that the load on the state budget will be quite big, because if we lose the youth, the older population will prevail, and that will create a huge burden on the pension fund. We will have a lot of retired servicemen who will need financial and medical support by the state. And in that case, the biggest challenge is the maximum facilitation of doing business, of employment, and obviously the key factor will be fighting corruption and raising of government investments and foreign investments to build new businesses, to build new industrial facilities, and to involve the youth that can come back to work here. And my colleagues from the Demographic Institute well, they were bringing up this issue that probably a part of the jobs should be filled by the migrants, by economic migrants coming to Ukraine, because that economic void, it should be filled by some working hands, by somebody who would be interested to work here, making more money than they could make in their countries. Ms. Alina, thank you very much. We support your opinion in this regard. In our opinion, the key moment is the development of communities. If we invest in our communities, if we invest funds, if we create new opportunities there, if we create new opportunities for doing business, new opportunities for getting residence there, that would be a better stimulus for coming back rather than some addressed aid to those who want to come back. So if we stimulate people to come back with some one-off aid, it would stimulate them less, rather than if they see some developed community where they can come back, where they can find some professional environment and get themselves realized professionally. So our advice is to put accent on the development of communities. It doesn't necessarily mean that we should forget about support with reintegration. We have to support people from the very moment of their decision to come back until the very moment of their reintegration into the community. But what will be mostly stimulating is the developed community. We also, in our studies, we see the tendency that people are not quite confident that the state will be able to support them financially, to support them with a new home. They have doubts about that, and those doubts, they were born because people back in their history were in need of such government support, and now they have this sentiment, they have these doubts that after they come back from abroad, they would be entitled to some kind of aid. And such promises of support, they may not produce such an effect. And the main emphasis, again, we see in development of the communities. Ms. Karen, you have a rich international experience in solution of such problems related to demographic crisis. Maybe you have some advice what we have to do to assist, to support the Ukrainians coming back home. Thank you.
So I think UNHCR aligns itself quite closely to what the other panelists have indicated. Certainly, I think what we see is that we maintain hope for people to return home by showing that there is an improvement in the situation. And certainly, I think also continuing, we see in the survey that some 39% of refugees and 50% of people displaced within Ukraine have made at least one short-term visit back home. And we see that enabling this flexibility of refugees to be able to travel back, to visit families, to maintain those linkages, and to see how the situation is improving, provides them with the information that they need to make the decision about when it's time for them to return home, but also maintains those linkages with the culture, with their families, with their communities. So I think that's an important element for countries of asylum to keep their systems flexible, to allow these short-term visits. The other thing I think is this focus on community development. Certainly we've seen the government's priorities in terms of its reconstruction plan. We also saw significant support at the recent London Recovery Conference. So I think focusing on supporting community-based development plans. We know that many local authorities have ambitious plans to rebuild their communities. So I think focusing on those areas where we know people will return back. So for example, our survey indicated that areas like Chernihiv, Kiev Oblast, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and Kiev City were areas where people intended to return home. And that's why, for example, we focus our housing, legal assistance, and support to local authorities, the departments of social protection in these areas, to ensure that when people do return home and where they have returned already, that they do see that this community development is there and that it's able to anchor them and their families within their communities. The other thing I think in terms of, in addition to sort of infrastructure and sort of reconstruction of harder elements, is also this softer side. And so really a focus on ensuring that social services are reestablished, that schools are in place, and also that places for communities to meet and to provide support to one another are also really key. What we see when we visit people whose houses we've reconstructed or communities where people are returning is that things like schools and community centers and places for people to meet are a really key element, particularly to encourage young families to return back and to want to remain there. So I think this focus on community-based development and area-based approaches is really important. And so continuing to advocate not only with the government to focus on that, which they are already doing so, and many local authorities are very strong on this, but also to continue to advocate for international support to support those efforts of the government to rebuild and to reconstruct not only those hard elements, but also the social and community infrastructure that is needed to anchor people in their homes.
Дякую вам, шановні колеги. Хочу дати можливість вам долучитися до нашої бесіди.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Please get involved in our conversation. I'm having Nadia Yurshenko, Ukrinform. I'm having a question to sociologists and demographers. We're talking about Ukrainians coming back home, but do you forecast another wave of refugees because the armed conflict is still going on? In Sumy region, the military administration is offering people to come back. The counteroffensive is going on in the south, in Zaporizhia region. Is there going to be another bigger wave of refugees? Thank you. Whether there will be or will not be another wave, it depends on the way the situation unfolds in the front lines. We see a lot of people, our scientists and the Western colleagues whom we were talking to, they were mentioning that the blackouts resulting from the missile strikes may cause another wave of refugees, but yes, the number of refugees increased, but there was no some significant wave that could be comparable to the first wave that was going on during the first weeks of the war. We cannot object it, but something very serious should happen for the people to relocate abroad. Regarding the people residing in the Sumy region, I hope that the majority of them will stay in Ukraine. They will probably relocate to the safer areas. There is a case when people relocate even within their regions, not even to other regions, not to central or western Ukraine, but just inside their regions, like Kharkiv region or Sumy region, which are along the border with Russia, but into the depth of Ukraine, which in the safer areas. I would like to add that during our municipal research, we've questioned the residents of the 21 regional centers, and we were asking them how they will act in case of jeopardization of military situation near their place of residence. And an interesting tendency, which was correctly confirmed by the word of my colleagues, that the people, in case of jeopardization of the situation, they would relocate to the neighboring areas which are safer. And talking about the western regions, we understand that in case of jeopardization of situation in the west, we understand the situation should become critical. The significant part of the residents of the western regions, they say that they would relocate abroad. Among the women, they would relocate abroad, and the men would enlist in the armed forces. But I want to say that the main wave of migration has already happened, because people who were financially capable of moving abroad, they have already done it, and those who lost their homes during the first days of the war or during the first weeks of the war, the full-scale invasion, they have already left abroad. So now those issues of migration, they are on individual basis. People just consider their financial condition, their financial stance, and they make the decision to leave, for example. And I agree with Mr. Oleksiy that it should be some extraordinary event that could cause some significant wave of migration. We have to understand that the most mobile part of the population, well, to live abroad, you have to psychologically and financially ready for it. So my forecast is that without jeopardization of situation, there would be no another significant wave of migration. Well, we understand that there is a part of Ukraine that we are in control of. You can see the situation there, but we have some of our residents living in the temporarily occupied territories, and as the counteroffensive begins, don't you think that those people from temporarily occupied areas will relocate abroad? Well, unfortunately, we don't have such information. We could not perform survey in the occupied territories. I would rather be inclined to ask those who studied the situation in the front lines or along the front lines, or who document the people coming from the occupied territories to non-occupied. So I have to ask Ms. Karen, maybe you expect the Ukrainians who are currently in temporarily occupied territories can become those people who are about to leave abroad. Are you ready for such challenges?
So we unfortunately also do not have access to people in areas under the temporary military occupation of the Russian Federation. But what we have seen is that there are certain individuals who are able to leave those areas and transit through other countries, and some of them have been able to return to government-controlled areas of Ukraine. And so certainly we have seen some arrivals of these individuals into Sumska Oblast, and also through other border crossings in western and southern Ukraine. I think there also sort of discussions with the State Border Guard Service and others who are sort of watching population movements. Also, I think we haven't seen large-scale movements at present, but certainly I think one does need to be prepared for movements. Perhaps just to also to go back to the previous point about potential new waves of displacement. You mentioned sort of significant incidents, and I think the recent destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, there was an expectation of potential large-scale movements, and we did not actually see that. And so it was exactly as colleagues here on the panel have indicated. People displaced within, Khersonska and Mykolaievska Oblast, but weren't necessarily displacing outside of the country. So I think, indeed, it would take something significant, and we have recently seen something significant that didn't result in large-scale displacement. So I think, we continue to have preparedness together with EU member states in Moldova for potential new arrivals, but at present it does not appear as though we are expecting a significant large-scale new displacement outside of Ukraine, but rather waiting for the return of refugees or people to return back inside of Ukraine. And I think right now we see a lot of movement across the border for people to move across for the holiday period. But I think our expectation is that rather than a new wave of displacement, it will instead be a wave of returns back into Ukraine.
Дякую вам. У нас є питання, прошу.
Thank you.
We're having question on the floor.
Sorry. Lorenzo Cremonesi from Corriere della Sera Italian Daily. Thank you for the media center. I think it's a major problem for the future of this country, and I would say that if it's not properly solved, Putin, who will lose the war, will win on this question, on the future of this country, because of the demographic, which means also economic question of the future of this country. I've been all the time on the front, and we have empty cities, you know, in those areas from, Zaporizhia to Donbass, etc. There are mainly old people and poor people who remain. The population there changed dramatically, and so I have different questions. First of all, to Ms. Karen. You spoke about 6 million. There was this number till a few weeks ago, 8 million. That means if you can tell us a little more about people who came back, etc. And then, of course, there is always an official number and an unofficial number. Secondly, when I talk with soldiers, when I talk with people all over, I don't have figures, but I can feel the situation. I feel it's a drama. You say that the expectation is 76% coming back. I don't have this impression at all. You know, I've been in many areas of war. People declare something, but they really do something totally opposite. So maybe it's true that they say that they want to come back, but they are not coming back. And this is a worry of many men. There are many soldiers who tell you openly, my family is there. There are many divorces, people who are going to divorce. There's the drama in family. We have a social drama in the country. People are not coming back. Women and children are not coming back. So the second question is there any policy by this government, or thinking about, to convince friendly government like Germany or Austria, who are, as you mentioned before, welcoming these migrants? Allowed me to say that the European in general are much more happy with the Ukrainian than from the Nigerian or the Egyptian, or from for obvious reasons. So, and these governments, we know, Austria and Germany, are actively trying to convince these people to stay, offering them money, support, free course of language. So there is a policy of integration. There is a policy of absorbing these people, not to expel them at all, or to just to give them temporary refuge. So is there any policy to tell to your friends in the European community, please help us to have these people back and not to absorb these people? Thank you.
So perhaps to your first question on the refugee numbers. So indeed, you would have seen, I think, around the 14th of June, a change in the numbers that UNHCR was reporting. And that is based upon a change in methodology. So in the past, we were using what we call flow data. So the data of people crossing borders, because it was taking time for EU member states and Moldova and other countries hosting refugees to record them. So again, this question that you sort of raised about how many people are actually there. And so for many countries, it took time for their registration systems to be able to actually record the number of Ukrainians who were there. And also, because there was a lot of mobility within the EU, there was a lot of movement of Ukrainians amongst different EU member states. So the data that we are now publishing on our portal, and will be publishing in the mid-year statistical report, is based upon the statistical data that states report of those who are registered either for temporary protection as refugees or other forms of residency. So this is the most accurate data that we now have. Certainly, I think what we did see were some returns, and one can see also, I mean, looking at the border crossing data, at certain points, for example, last summer, we saw a net inflow into Ukraine as opposed to for example, at the beginning of the war, where we certainly saw a net outflow. And again, going back to the point that I made earlier, I think this ability of people to move and to come back to Ukraine, but to be able to go back and avail themselves of international protection is really important, so that people maintain their linkages and so that they can come and check on the situation and make an informed decision. Whether or not people will actually return when they tell us, we can only report on what people tell us. But certainly what we will be doing as we continue with the intention surveys is to do longitudinal studies. So to call people back who told us that they were going to return and see if they really did. Just to have a better sense of whether or not people have been able to realize their intentions and their plans to return home.
Can I ask you, is 8 million, is it possible? I mean, you are talking now about official numbers, but then if you look a bit broadly, can we say that in effect the real number is larger?
I'm afraid I'm not in a position to say whether or not the number is larger or not. We can only report on the number that we have. I mean, this is not a context where I think, we're able to estimate. But certainly the number that we have based upon the various sources of data, this is the best estimate that we have, also having looked at the flow in and out. In terms of the investment in Ukrainians abroad, I mean, just to say, I think it's also an investment in potentially the future and the reconstruction of Ukraine, right? If children are able to go to school, if young people are able to obtain those skills that they need to rebuild Ukraine when they come back, I think that's also important. So I think it's not just about integration into foreign countries. It's about continuing to invest in young people and children so that they have the skills that they need, so that when they are able to return home, that they're able to contribute to the reconstruction and the recovery of Ukraine. So I think it's important that there is this balance, because I think building the skill sets that Ukraine will need to rebuild itself is also an important thing, so that time spent abroad during the international armed conflict is not a wasted time, but it is a time that is invested in those young people and in those children so that they have those skills that they need, as I said, when they come back, that they can contribute to the reconstruction.
Дякую вам. Наприкінці нашої зустрічі я б хотіла вам...
Thank you very much. To wrap it up, I would like to ask you a question. For those who were questioning, the main factor for them was the safety and security. All the respondents say so. We understand that we all aspire to our victory, and we think that it's about to be happening soon. And according to your studies, in case of that victory, what will be the number of Ukrainians who would be ready to come back right away? Let me start. First of all, we need to understand that the feeling, the perception of the continuity of war is different in Ukraine and abroad. So based on the latest research, the hope that Ukraine will end soon is present here in Ukraine. People staying abroad are more pessimistic about that. We use the word declaration of intentions. So if the war ends today, it will be one situation, because the social family connection is not lost, and after a year that figure will be different. I would say that if it ends right now, the number of those coming back would be about 15%, and on top of the economic factor, it's also important for the government to create the comfortable psycho-emotional situation for the people to come back, so that their connection to their home is not lost. If there are certain restriction of rights for such persons, obviously it would be an important factor for the people to take decision. If they would not feel free in all of their decisions, they will choose not in favor of our country. If it all ends soon and the comfortable conditions for the Ukrainians to come back are created, they will come back, because now they're still emotionally connected to Ukraine. Thank you. Well, I agree that those people who would be coming back to Ukraine immediately without some previous assessment of situation will be not so numerous. And regarding the majority, it depends on the factors that are very difficult to forecast now. It depends on the efficiency of investments. It will depend on the condition of economy, on the business development climate. Even the problem of environmental protection may influence the decision of the people to come back. We were talking a lot today about the intentions, about the declared intentions, but it's, I would say, it's good that we have those surveys, that we ask people what they plan, what they think, but we have to keep in mind that their intentions may change in both ways. On one hand, there is a migration law that the longer the migration goes on, the smaller fraction of people is coming back. But on the other hand, those who have already taken the decision to stay abroad, they may still be coming back given a number of reasons or number of circumstances. For example, those who left are mostly the women with higher education, mostly from Kharkiv region, for example, and they are highly qualified specialists. Not very much of them can get employed by their profession, and having worked as a saleswoman for a number of years, for example, if they used to be a manager here and they switch to a shop attendant profession, or if they were a chief doctor in a hospital and they are forced to work as a nurse in a hospital abroad, for example. So if there will be an efficient recovery of Ukraine, it may stimulate those who decided to stay abroad to come back to Ukraine. So, Ms. Alina, do you think that those who are ready to return, that their intentions may be changing? Well, yes, I agree with my colleagues, but again, it's not only something that depends on the intentions of our people, whether they want or do not want to return, and it's based on the conditions that they stay abroad now. So now they are all under temporary protection that was established specifically for the refugees from Ukraine, so they could adapt into the society as soon as possible. So that they could get their documents processed right away, but this status is provided not for the lifetime. This status was only established with the beginning of the war, such a kind of a soft relocation, and as soon as the war ends, when situation becomes safe and secure in Ukraine, it will be one of those moments when the European Union will close that status, and people who were not able to adapt there, who did not get job there, who did not enter universities there, they will be forced to leave those countries because they will have no more support there. And well, for what we know, the financial support is available in not in all of the countries of the European Union. Again, people may be getting students' visas, but again, for those who still get financial support and they have no grounds to obtain such students' visa, they will be forced to come back to Ukraine. And currently we don't have a forecast under which conditions European Union is about to end the effectiveness of this status. So there is such an external factor as the loss of the reasons to stay in the country of their temporary residence. What we also observe in our survey, people talk about different periods of coming back. Some of them want to come back right away after the end of the war, but some of them got employed, some of them entered universities, and they say they would like to come back. However, after they get some experience abroad, they get the maximum experience that is offered by the country of their temporary residence. Why getting this experience? Because it's something that they would like to implement in Ukraine further on, to implement some local changes, to open their businesses in Ukraine, and those will be the people who would not be coming back to Ukraine right away after the end of the war. Maybe they will be coming back in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. They understand that they will be staying in Europe until that very moment when they realize that they got enough experience that they can implement in Ukraine as soon as they come back. And talking about those people who say they don't want to come back now, there is a number of reasons, and one of the reasons that we have not mentioned today, the people who left from the occupied territories, they see the return to their homes as re-traumatizing experience, something that would remind them of those events that they experienced during the occupation, and they don't want to come back to Ukraine for that reason. That will be the most difficult group that we should work with to bring them back to Ukraine. But there is a fraction of people who say they don't want to come back. We should not take it negative, or we should not consider it a huge loss of ours. We should rather consider those people as our representatives in the European countries. We should set better cooperation. We should keep in better touch with them so that they become our voice in Europe, our ambassadors, right, so that they turn into our active diaspora. I think that it would be very good, and this is something they're doing now. So talking to the people, if they know local language, or at least English language, they enter into discussions with local residents, they tell them about the Ukrainian history, they try to debunk the myth that those people may have about Ukraine, so they take proactive position. And right now we should start telling them that what they're doing abroad is very important for us, and we would like to support them in their efforts to preserve connection with them, even if they don't come back to Ukraine. For us, they could become a source, a voice of Ukraine, and networking of Ukrainians with European communities. It can be some creation of institutions, international institutions, some cultural establishment of some cultural events, cultural platforms. So we should consider that fraction of the people who don't intend to come back as an opportunity to develop our diasporas abroad. I want to thank you very much for this comprehensive discussion. It's one of the most important topics for our country, for our society now, and I appreciate that you're bringing it up. I want to thank you. I want to thank our journalists for the interest to this topic. I hope in cooperation we can solve this problem. And obviously I want to thank our armed forces, thanks to whom we can hold events like that. Let's continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.